In this video, we'll look at the different sentence types in English. We'll classify them according to purpose and according to structure. It is a good idea to use different structures in your writing because your writing will be more varied, more interesting, and you'll also score higher in tests. Okay, let's look at the first one. So here is the first classification, which is classification according to purpose. So the purpose of the sentence, how you'll be using the sentence. Let's look at the first one. It's called declarative sentence or assertive sentence. This is the type of sentence which makes a statement. So just stating or saying something like this one. They are football players. So just telling the reader or the listener that these people play football. That's all. So this is how you define a declarative or assertive sentence. Next, we have the exclamatory sentence, which is a statement. So it's the same as a declarative or assertive sentence, but it ends with this, an exclamation mark. It is used to show a surprise or shouting. So it is more forceful than a normal declarative or assertive sentence. Let's look at this example. I want to go home. So this one is a statement, but it ends with an exclamation mark. So the writer or the speaker probably really wants to go home. Or maybe he or she is shouting. So that's why you have this exclamation mark. And so it becomes an exclamatory sentence. Next is the interrogative sentence. This is a question basically. So you use an interrogative sentence to ask a question, meaning that it needs to end in a question mark like this. Okay, so how can I help you is a question, right? Because you're asking whether you can assist that person. So this is an example of an interrogative sentence. Next is an imperative sentence. It is a sentence which you use to make a command or a request. The difference from other types of sentences is that this kind of sentence begins with the base form of a verb. So base form of a verb, meaning that you don't add any s, any ing or ed, and if you use the word be, it's be. So you don't use is, am, are to start a sentence like this. Okay, so let's look at some examples. We have eat and we have please wash this. So as you can see, these two sentences begin with the base form of a verb. For this one, we just add please to make it more polite. Okay, so this is the imperative sentence. You don't have a subject. Now, for the imperative sentence, you can end with a full stop or you can change it to an exclamation mark if you're shouting or like you want to show surprise or something. So this one, you have the flexibility to choose. Okay, so this is the first classification of the types of sentences in English. You classify them by purpose. So to recap, we have the first one, which is just to state something. The second one, to show surprise or shouting. The third one, to ask a question. And the last one, to make a command or a request. Let's now look at the next classification, which is classification according to structure. So how that sentence is constructed. The first one is called the simple sentence. So a simple sentence has one independent clause. Remember that an independent clause, you need at least a subject, a verb, and a complete thought. Like this one. Jack went up the hill. So we have Jack as the subject. This is a noun, and went up as the verb. So this one is a complete thought because by reading it, you understand that the person Jack went up to somewhere high, so went up a hill. So this is a simple sentence. It's pretty straightforward. Now, in a simple sentence, you don't always need to have only one subject. You can have more than one subject. You can say, for example, Jack and Jill went up the hill. You can say it like that. It means that these two people, so the two subjects, they did the same thing, which is they went up the hill. So this is still considered a simple sentence. You can also have more than one verb. So you can say, Jack went up the hill, and what's next? And fetched, which is to get, a pail, so a bucket of water. Okay, so what does this mean? It means that Jack, he did two things. First, he went up the hill, and second, he got a bucket of water. So as you can see, this one has one subject but two verbs, but it's still considered a simple sentence because there's only one independent clause. You can also have more than one subject and more than one verb. So you can say, Jack and Jill went up the hill and fetched a pail of water. So we have two subjects, Jack and Jill, and two verbs. So went up and fetched. And this is still considered a simple sentence because you still have one independent clause. It's just that it's done by two people and that clause contains two verbs, that's all. Okay? So that's the simple sentence. So for the simple sentence concerning punctuation marks, you don't need to add anything. You don't need a comma. Okay? So if it were Jack went up the hill and fetched a pail of water, you wouldn't need anything here. Okay, so that's for the simple sentence. Now, when you combine two simple sentences together, you get a compound sentence because a compound sentence has two or more independent clauses. Remember that a simple sentence has one independent clause, but when you have two or more independent clauses, you call it a compound sentence. You connect the two independent clauses or the two simple sentences by a comma and a coordinator. So here is a comma and here is a coordinator or coordinating conjunction, which we will talk about in more detail later on. So basically in English, there are 7 coordinators. You have and, you have but, you have nor, or, you have so, yet, and for. So these are the coordinators in English. They can be used to join the compound sentence. But remember, you need a comma like this before the coordinator. Okay, so let's look at this example sentence. Jack went up the hill, but Jill stayed home. So we have two independent clauses. This is the first one. This is the second one. And this thing joins the two together. So we know that the first subject, Jack, he did one thing, which is he went up the hill. And we also know that the second subject, Jill, did another thing. She stayed home. She didn't go anywhere. And we have but to join them, so to show contrast, basically. So this is one way to join two independent clauses together to make a compound sentence. In English, we consider this as giving equal importance to both the first and the second clauses. There is also another way you can join independent clauses together. You can use a colon like this. If you use a colon, you don't need a coordinator. Okay, so just a colon and then the second independent clause. If you do it like this, it gives you more emphasis on the second clause. You can also use a semicolon like this to join two independent clauses together like this. And in this case, you also don't need a coordinator or coordinating conjunction. So if you do it like this, it means that you give these two clauses equal importance. Or sometimes we use it like this because the second clause simply restates the first clause. So the second clause has a similar content to the first clause. If you look at this sentence, it says, Jack went up the hill. And the second one says, he walked higher and higher. So as you can see, went up the hill and walked higher and higher are similar. So we can use a semicolon, okay, just to help restate the first, just to show that these two clauses are quite connected. But this is not a requirement, so you can choose between this, so a comma and a coordinator, a colon and a semicolon to join two independent clauses to create a compound sentence. So it doesn't always have to restate the first, okay? You don't need to, or it doesn't have to be like this one to, to give more emphasis. You can just choose. It doesn't mean that you're trying to emphasize the second one. So you don't be too serious about this. Just choose one that suits you best, okay? Now let's look at the next type, which is the complex sentence. So a complex sentence has one independent clause and one dependent clause. So we now have two different clause types. And of course, the one which is the dependent clause is given less importance. So in this example, when Jack went up the hill, Jill stayed home. This is the independent clause. This is the dependent clause because it has a subordinator or subordinating conjunction in the beginning. So this one has less importance. This one has more importance. Also, if you begin the sentence with the subordinating conjunction, so this one, meaning that you begin the sentence with the dependent clause, you need a comma at the end of the dependent clause. However, if you begin the sentence with the independent clause like this, so Jill stayed home when Jack went up the hill. So if you wrote this here, then you don't need a comma. Okay, so to repeat, if you start the sentence with the dependent clause, you need a comma before you write the independent clause. But if you begin the sentence with the independent clause, you don't need a comma before the dependent clause. Okay, so that's all. You just need to look out for this. And remember, a complex sentence is a combination of one independent clause and one dependent clause. That's all. Now let's look at the last type of sentence, which is the compound complex sentence. Basically, it is a combination of the complex sentence and the compound sentence. At the minimum, we need at least two independent clauses and at least one dependent clause. And these clauses can be in any order, okay? But we still need to use the same rules that we have talked about for the compound sentence and for the complex sentence. Let's look at this example. When Jack went up the hill, Jill stayed home and she started reading. So we have this as the dependent clause because we have a subordinator here. This one is an independent clause, and this one is also an independent clause. So when you join them together, for the connection between the dependent clause and the independent clause, you need to follow the rules of the complex sentence. So in this case, the dependent clause comes first before the independent clause, which means you need a comma, okay? And for these two, because you have two independent clauses joining, you need to follow the same rules as the compound sentence. So in this case, we have a comma and a coordinator. But remember, we can also use a colon or a semicolon. Okay, so that's how you remember this sentence structure. When there's a connection between a dependent and independent clause, you follow the rules of the complex sentence, and for the connection between the two independent clauses, you just use the rules of the compound sentence. That's all. So these are the four sentence types in English according to structure. When you write your essay, remember to use all four because certain types of sentences are more powerful, like shorter ones, but longer ones allow you to express yourself in more detail. Okay, so remember to use them all. Mix and match. All right.